each month, we invite a national thought leader to join us, and we're very excited about today's guest, and share the work that they're doing to support all types of entrepreneurs in local economies. And really, like I said, the goal is to explore these new ideas and use them as inspiration for our community to set policies and programs here that we can really inspire entrepreneurship and innovation. So as a little background, in case you're new, we are Startup Tucson. This is the team, Sophia, Kenesha, Dre, and myself. Startup Tucson is an economic development nonprofit that's working to support entrepreneurs and startups here in Tucson, Arizona. We serve approximately 3,000 entrepreneurs a year through educational programming, mentorship, and networking opportunities. And we're really working to make Tucson a place where entrepreneurs feel supported and can thrive. So with that, I will turn it over to Dre. My name is Liz Pocock, and I'm the CEO, and Dre is our Executive VP, and she's going to introduce our guest.
Hey everyone, if you don't know me yet, Liz said it, I'm Dre Thompson, and my background is a little bit in community development. That's been kind of a lot of where my academic background, and so really being able to, moving into the startup space, really being able to combine those two passions has been so exciting. I can't even believe that I just get to like speak to all these amazing heroes. So if you haven't seen all the rest of the innovation economics, they're all online. You can go check those out. This will be recorded, and you can check it out there. So I did want to talk a little bit about Dell Gines. So we had I first knew about him because he was a contributing author to Building Entrepreneurship Ecosystems and Community of Color. We're going to send a link out to this. It is so important reading. This was actually required reading for all Startup Tucson employees, and it is a really important guide. So I sort of knew about him from that, and then I started to really just see what an incredible voice he has been. He is one of just the leading voices on grow your own entrepreneurship-led economic development strategies. His particular areas of passion are rural and inner city economic development, and really providing information, research, and strategies, those toolkits to really help build economic ecosystems. So what we're going to be talking about today is really focus around how startup ecosystems are sort of stubbornly resistant to inclusivity, and really specifically what the economic consequences are for communities that are not inclusive. So this conversation, I think, is really important for Tucson because it will help contextualize why, even when so many of the stakeholders here are, we have calls for inclusive entrepreneurship, we really believe in this as a value, but we still see that they sort of fail in implementation or those micro level interactions with day-to-day players. So our hope is that you're going to walk away with some tactical strategies to build more equitable, just, and economically robust innovation ecosystems. We are really honored to have Dell here because he's often a keynote at places like South by Southwest, the Kauffman EShip Summit, and many other national conferences. So we are just so delighted that he took some time to speak with us today. So with that, I will pass it to Dell.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be with you today. I think, Dre, remind me of how long kind of just the initial chat before we get to the Q&A is.
About 15 minutes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. I know, all of us are dealing with this crazy time, and I am too. I'm probably like most of you. So we're on I don't know if most of you are familiar with the way the Federal Reserve works, but we have 12 regional banks and then the board of governors, and then the presidents rotate with the individuals from the board to set monetary policy. And so we cover pretty much the Midwest, region, and I believe you all are under the San Francisco Fed in Arizona, and each of us are organized a little bit differently. And but all of us have a community development department, which actually emerged from the 1970s because of redlining. So Congress passed an act that the Federal Reserve banks all have to have what is called a CAO, a Community Affairs Officer, and a Community Development or Affairs Department, to kind of initially address the issues of redlining coming out of the 70s, and now just more broadly to address the issues of the low and moderate income population. So since for the 10 years I've been here, I've worked on, ecosystem building because I come out of a Black community in Omaha where back in 2008, and it's always flexes depending on the data or whoever's researching it, but we had the #1 childhood poverty rate in the nation, and number 3, adult African-American poverty rate in the nation, based upon a Pew Research report. And you step back and you look at that and you say, well, wait a minute, you know, you got Warren Buffett there, Berkshire Hathaway, and all the millionaires that, you know, that business has spawned in Nebraska. Literally, there was a time back when we were really trying to push for some things. You can walk in a room in Omaha and be in a room with 5 billionaires. Like, where else can you do that? We have more Fortune 500 companies than anywhere else per capita, prior to ConAgra leaving. So you look at that and you say, okay, well, within that economic development environment, how in the world can you have such a huge, you know, disparity within your African American population? And that, you know, and that along with my background of being, you know, an old community activist, a business banker, a combination of those at the time, and doing all this stuff in the community. When I got to the Fed and my boss asked me, you know, hey, we're one of our components is we're trying to stand up as a specific focus on small business and economic development. What do you want to do? And so back in 2011, you know, I told her, I said, if we focus on the intersection between small business and economic development, we'll be thought leaders in 5 years. And 5 years after that date, we launched the first national entrepreneurship ecosystem building conference called Growing Entrepreneurial Communities, and hosted at the Kansas City Fed. We had produced a couple guides already up to that point, the original Grow Your Own guide, the Funder's Guide to Supporting Entrepreneurship, Case for Youth Entrepreneurship Education, and other things. And so we've been trying to push the envelope on it, you know, really hard. Now, so obviously as the field has grown, initially the early stages of the field, and this is just some historical context for you, was really oriented towards what is still kind of the dominant orientation of entrepreneurship ecosystems, which is kind of your startup culture. So, you know, how do you, and I usually call it, you know, kind of the startup, tech-oriented venture capital, you know, triangle of ecosystems that really were oriented towards saying, what can we do to be like Silicon Valley? Or, hey, let's all read Brad Feld's book on what he did in Boulder, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem that that is with both of those models, and I have respect for Brad, but the problem that we have with those models is that, I actually said this on a couple podcasts lately, I said, if you want to replicate Silicon Valley, does that mean you're replicating the racism and sexism of Silicon Valley too? If you want to replicate Boulder, does that mean you're going to have a population that's almost unique to any population in America, where you have more guys than women? That almost never happens anywhere. And the average age is younger. And also the majority of that population is white with some Asians and some smattering of other ethnic groups. So when we talk about replication of some of these early models, and even the way the early field developed, you're really talking a lot about startups with venture-backed firms that are oriented towards technology, and they were mostly young white men and some Asian men. That's what we were talking about when we talked about the early stages of entrepreneurship ecosystem building. And for those of you that have been around the space for a while, I bet you'll agree with me. And that was the orientation of the time. Now, we've been fortunate that over the past decade, the field is evolving. The field is evolving and expanding in two primary ways. The first way is that the dominant focus of, hey, everything has to be a high growth tech orientation connected to some kind of angel or venture fund. That's not the case anymore. The concept of ecosystem building is expanded towards other forms of business than growth-oriented businesses. While growth-oriented businesses are still a prize for a lot of communities, the concept of it has expanded dramatically. So if you look at what Forward Cities does and Fay Horwitz out there, they look broadly at the various ecosystems that consist within a given community. Because if you realize, like 97% of all businesses in the nation will never have over 10 employees, right? So if we're talking about building an ecosystem for entrepreneurs, depending on how you define entrepreneur, you know, you're probably going to end up touching on a lot of different, if you want to do it broadly and you want to do it as a really robust economic development strategy, you're probably going to have to look at it across different lenses than just your high growth startup, even though they do add a lot of value. There's no denying your high growth young firms are generating a lot of job and employment growth in the nation. But if you want economic development to drive true equity, you have to broaden the lens on what you include in that process of ecosystem development. And then the second development is this significant push towards equity and inclusion within the ecosystem space. And so I work closely with Kauffman Foundation, so close to the point where I told Andy Stoll over there, who kind of runs their conference, I said, there's no need for us to do our biannual conference anymore because there's so much overlap between your conference and ours that I would rather just support you. So I'm on their work groups and all of those things. And the good thing about what they've done over at Kauffman with eShip is they said very explicitly from the beginning that the field of ecosystem building has to be diverse. It has to be diverse and inclusive, and it has to be baked in the cake. It can't be an add-on. It can't be an after the fact. It can't be kind of this little piece where you say, and we're going to throw this in. It has to be interwoven through all facets of the ecosystem building field as it continues to emerge and develop. And so those two things have been kind of the evolution of the field of entrepreneurship ecosystem building. Even though the field has a long way to go, I think those two orientations alone, if we can keep those in front of us, will really help us address some of the fundamental challenges that we're seeing in America today. I tell people all the time, I don't care if you think Black Lives Matter or not, there's no such thing as social justice without economic power. Conceptually, you just have to understand that as a fundamental truth, that if you do not have economic power in general, but usually in a democratic capitalist society like ours, economic power, then you're always relying on other people to give you social justice or to give you something because you are no threat, right? People that have power are some kind of a threat. And by threat, it doesn't mean that I'm going to kill you or do these other things to you. But what it means is that if you do something, there's very real and vivid consequences to that behavior that you're going to do to another individual. The history of America, when you talk about race, racism, and oppression, has been to marginalize those that weren't from the dominant group, usually to exploit their labor. The most vivid example is slavery. Once we got rid of slavery, the nation didn't know what to do with Black people after that, right? Which is why they stuck us in Jim Crow and segregation. They're like, okay, well, we can't exploit you for your labor. We're going to isolate you and keep you blocked out of the rest of the economy to the degree which we can. Then those communities of ours that did do well, and there were quite a few. My colleague down in Oklahoma City sent me a great book on the Black townships of Oklahoma City. You have Hayti, many of you may not be familiar with that, which was in, I believe, North Carolina, a robust growth city for African Americans. You have the Harlem Renaissance, you know, in New York City and what occurred there and all the art and the businesses and the culture that came out of that. And of course, most of you know by now Black Wall Street, Greenwood, Oklahoma, which was the only time in American history where the United States Army bombed a city on its own soil. Because that happened because whites that came back from the war were looking right across the way, and they saw this robust Black, you know, economy that was happening with all of these businesses, all these movie theaters, everything in the Black community was doing well. They created a pretense by which, you know, they could go in and disrupt that economy, and ultimately led to frustrations, riots, and the bombing of that city mostly out of existence, even though it did have a recovery. So we have to situate, you know, entrepreneurship ecosystem building within the history of America, which sought to marginalize individuals that were not white in order to justify, you know, the support of whites over Blacks. And I wrote an article in Medium that talked about that. In fact, you know, Gary Becker won a Nobel Prize back in the late 60s for his work in the 60s, which talked about the taste for discrimination, which essentially was showing that white people were willing to pay either more for the same product if it was produced by a white person because they didn't want to buy it from a Black person or whomever with that discriminating lens could be. It could have been women or whatever. And also that Black or brown or those diverse individuals had to actually do more to get the same pay. And the point that I was making in that article that I wrote was that when you have, I'm bringing it back to ecosystem building now, is that as an ecosystem builder, you cannot say you're a good ecosystem builder if you don't practice inclusivity. And this isn't, in this argument is not a moral argument, it's an economic rationality argument. So if I have two people, right, that have the same entrepreneurial skill, but only one of them gets the resources because they're of a particular ethnic group, and the other one gets fewer resources because they're of a different ethnic group that's unfavored, then you're going to have an economic output that favors one group versus another. So that creates economic disparity by race, gender, or whatever you want to look at it. Now, but let's think about it another way. So if I have a Latino woman who has much better entrepreneurial talent and much more entrepreneurial potential than, let's say, a Caucasian female, Caucasian woman, white woman, but the white woman, because she is white and because she has the networks that are conferred to her because of that, gets more resources than the Latina woman with better entrepreneurial talent, then you automatically have a less efficient economy, because you should be given the resources, the greater resources, or at bare minimum, the equal resources to the entrepreneur talent. So if we believe that the research of Gallup and their BP10 and Business Strengths Finders, which says, hey, we've done this research for on this high growth entrepreneur orientation, and that it's consistent across race or gender, geographic location. There's a percentage of people across every population that has the same level of potential to be a high growth entrepreneur, but we're not seeing an equitable distribution of high growth entrepreneurship by race, gender, geography, or whatever. Then we know just logically that it's a cultural thing or a community thing, or other things are going on. And so when you look at the fact that in spite of Black women increasing businesses by 1 million from 2002 to 2012, far faster, especially on a per capita basis, than any other group, but yet their average sales is $27,000 compared to their next closest peer group, which is Latino women at $54,000, then you know there's environmental factors going. When you look at the majority of Black women businesses that are started, 65 to 70% of them are within 4 industry codes. You almost have statistically 0 Black women owned manufacturing companies or wholesale companies. Then you know that there's something going on in the environment. And so I'd argue that the task of an ecosystem builder is to explore and understand the areas of geographic bias, which there's a huge bias against rural and certain kind of communities in the nation, especially from an economic development lens, and racial, ethnic, and gender bias, and how they play a role in minimizing the potential growth of the local economy through entrepreneurship. That's the economic argument that we're making. The moral argument is it's just wrong. Like, I think we're past the point in the United States where we should be like, man, that woman can't get venture capital because she's a woman. But yet we still see it happening. I mean, what's baffling to me, and I don't know if your audience knows this, Dre, it wasn't until 1980s that women could even get a business loan without their husband signing off on it. Like, we're not talking about that long ago, where women had to drag their husband in and say, honey, you know I'm a way better entrepreneur than you, but I need you to sign on this loan because the banker won't let me have it if you don't give it to me. So this is the process of an ecosystem builder. While obviously the ultimate objective of an ecosystem builder is to drive local development, to supporting through complex and through the networks of communities and relationships, the startup and growth of entrepreneurs, that's the big O objective, because we recognize that entrepreneurship has a lot of economic and social benefits. But the other objective, once you start getting more downstream from that, the objective is to ensure that we're creating this Big Ten approach so that people who have a desire, who have a talent, and who have the motivation to be entrepreneurs, regardless of race, gender, geography, have access to the same level, or at least a roughly equivalent level of resources as everyone else to do so. And we know that doesn't happen in today's society. So then in the last, I guess, set of comments before we go into the questions is, so when we talk about inclusive ecosystem building, and I'm going to pat myself on the back, because it was dope writing. I'm not even gonna lie. Like if you read the Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Building in Communities of Color, like some of the things Rodney and I put in there, I had never heard of in the field. So God must have been speaking into my mind and writing it onto the paper. So one of the things that I want to point out, which is I remember, so I went down, I live in Omaha, Nebraska. I went down to Atlanta to hang out with Rodney at Morehouse. So he had an OHUB, his ecosystem building model on Morehouse campus. And we're sitting there working through this, and he goes to the whiteboard and he starts working through kind of this pyramid of ecosystem building. And the unique thing about that pyramid in the guide, if you take a look at it, get a chance to take a look at it, is that he starts the process of ecosystem building from essentially when people are kids or at the early exposure level. Most of us start ecosystem building at the point of entry for the entrepreneur, right? So when that entrepreneur comes into the startup program or the accelerator, or tells somebody that they want to be an entrepreneur, that's usually when we as ecosystem builders kick in, right? Where we try to plug them in, we try to get them into program and connect them to access to capital. Rodney's like, no, wait a minute. So those of us who understand sales funnels get this. Like that early stage exposure is going to be so influential, because first, if we don't do good early stage exposure across race, ethnicity, gender, and geography, what you're doing is actually limiting the potential pool of candidates for entrepreneurship to even get into your ecosystem building programs and processes, right? So if we can expand that up, expand that wider, get people, whether it's in formal or informal mechanisms, whether it's in K through 12 or others, to start saying, hey, this is what entrepreneurship is. This is a pathway that you could consider. This is what it looks like. You can do this. You can do this. Because oftentimes a lot of our kids aren't told that. Our kids are told, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? And usually it's some kind of career. Like we want to be a fireman, nothing wrong with fireman, doctor, lawyer, whatever. But very rarely have I ever heard a kid say, man, I want to be the next great entrepreneur. I want to go raise venture capital funds and then, make a great exit so I have $100 million to turn around and invest back in the community. When have you ever heard that? Like, I've never heard it, and I talk to kids a lot. So one is the key is that early stage entry in that process. Also, what the pyramid does is it shows the intersection between careers and entrepreneurs. A lot of the bias in even talking about entrepreneurship, and you all will get this too, is that this false perception that it's all these young hot shot kids that are starting firms that are growing fast and making exits. No, research shows that the average age of a successful tech founder is like 47. The average age of a successful biotech founder is like 51. So Rodney and us talk about the career factor in it, because what you have is people, going in and out, right? Like people are learning a lot of skill sets on the career that then they in turn, utilize to leverage or inform their entrepreneurial opportunities, identify the problems, develop social and human capital, and then launch off into their entrepreneurial venture. So there's that. And then the final component that I want to, chat with real briefly is the distinction between an inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem and building an ecosystem in a specific community. Because those two, while they overlap and are related, they have a significant level of differences, and we have to understand what those differences are. So usually, like this whole diversity and inclusion language comes mostly from that corporate orientation and sometimes large scale organizations, and it's kind of penetrated into the ecosystem world. And so, we can stick with it and use it, but understand that it was designed for a different kind of system than what we do as ecosystem builders. But in a corporate, so for a corporate setting, whatever, inclusivity and equity and diversity simply mean that they want to give every individual that walks through that door is that same opportunity to flourish in the corporation, to be able to support the corporation, right? It's not for morality's sake. Like we were taught first day of Masters of Business Finance class that corporations exist to maximize shareholder value. Therefore, any pursuit of diversity and inclusion, we have to at least consider that it's just to be able to do a better job of generating shareholder value. So, but it's contained within that container. Ecosystem inclusion is different. It's open space, it's wide, it's dynamic, and it's much more interactive than that, because it's about creating owners versus producing employees. So this concept of inclusion in ecosystems, you have to look at it a little bit differently. So inclusion in ecosystems means that in your broader ecosystem, to the degree which is possible, because we have to be rational. We can't be all things to all people all the time, but to the degree which is possible, we need to make sure that anybody that enters into what we consider our more formalized ecosystem processes are feeling like they are supported, that they're valued, and that there's a place for them in that. Right. So let's look at the a hypothetical scenario using our historical ecosystem building models as an example. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember the early stages of ecosystem building in these startup things. And what you, at least in my experience, you would go to these kind of startup things and it'd be like a bunch of young frat boys and penny loafers and skinny jeans drinking beer and talking about what business they're going to start. Now, imagine inserting a Native American 50-year-old woman who has a tremendous entrepreneurial idea and telling her, this is where you go to do that, right? Like, you automatically start seeing some of the challenges within that scenario. Now, she may have like the Gallup strengths of woo and all these other things, and that may be like, yeah, bet I'm going in there. Let me go drink beer with the young guys. But in many ways, even that particular environment that we structured all these early ecosystem startup events and activities was exclusionary in and of itself. So we need to figure out ways to make the existing ecosystem processes and activities more inclusive by figuring out where the unique audiences are coming from that would want to participate. So that's the inclusive ecosystem. We have to distinguish that between building an ecosystem in a particular community. So if I'm going to develop an ecosystem in, let's say, the Latino community in Tucson, right? Which even that is overly broad, being that, you know, as I understand from our earlier conversations, almost half the population in Tucson. So there's probably sub-communities even within that community we would have to consider. But let's use the entire community. Then what I want to do is actually look at the unique or idiosyncratic cultures and customs and processes and belief systems and ways of engagement in that culture and their dominant geographic location, and work within that process itself to build an ecosystem in the Latino culture in Tucson, Arizona. So that's group-based inclusion versus individual inclusion. So individual inclusion is how we traditionally conceive it. How do we make things more, the pre-existing ecosystem work we do, more accessible to diverse populations? You can call it age, gender, geography, whatever. Group-based ecosystem inclusion means you're figuring out how to work with that entire group and their unique culture, languages, and strengths to foster an ecosystem among themselves so that they can better participate as an entire group in the broader ecosystem and increase economic development that way. I would argue that if you can figure out ways to do those two things well, then you're going to dramatically address a few things. One, the common concern of economic development, which is improvement in economic development, because you're creating greater wealth production, greater employment opportunities, greater economic equity. With those things, you then begin to address fundamentally, either directly or indirectly, the issues that we're facing in America today, which are issues of discrimination, bias, inequitable resourcing, all of those other things. Because you can't do one without doing the other. Those two have to happen simultaneously. So that's kind of where I'll leave it, and we can open it up for any kind of particular questions that you have. But I would just encourage you, like, keep the last thing that I'll say. I mean, so a lot of people will ask, well, where do you start with this? And I always tell people, you start with intentionality, recognizing that you can't, what's the saying? I was telling my wife this the other day about my dissertation. What's the best way to eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? Like, not too many of us I know, or anybody I know, could eat an elephant in 1 or 2 bites. It's a process, you know, that you have to go through. So is inclusivity, inclusive ecosystem building, but it all starts with collaborative intentionality, getting a critical mass, or if not necessarily a critical mass, a critical group of individuals who will always keep that in the forefront of their mind as they do the work, and say, we're going to do the work, but we're not going to do it without asking the question, Are we doing the best in regard to what we can do now? We may be able to do better in the future, but according to what we can do now at ensuring that this is inclusive, that we're attempting to understand the needs of the variety of stakeholders that we have in this process, and that we're building something to create as big a tent as possible for the strategy that we're trying to do. So now I'll open it up for questions.
That's great, Dell. I feel like you answered a lot of the questions Dre and I were going to ask you. So we're going to keep our part short because I've seen some amazing questions come in the group chat that we want to make sure we leave time for. So everyone on the call, if you have more questions, please pop them in the kind of main chat and keep it to one per person if possible. And then we'll pull those. And if you're comfortable, you can ask your question directly to Dell, or we can ask it for you. Totally fine, whatever you prefer. So I just kind of want to start, you touched a little bit on it, Dell, but specific steps. We have a lot of people on the call that are who we would consider ecosystem builders in our community. And so what are some specific steps that we can take to reduce the types of biases that you're describing? And if in particular there's any trainings or processes that you've found particularly effective in kind of the day-to-day of how we build this inclusivity that we want in our community.
Yeah, you know, we've kind of got away from what, and it's no fault of ours. The world has just changed. We can communicate faster. We can communicate over so many different platforms in different ways. But kind of that old school, back when communities were very small and you had to interact on a more regular basis, right? You had to see your neighbor, all of those things. We kind of lost some of that in favor of, communication, rapid communication and communication where we can really segment it more. Like I can find any group that I want on Facebook, and then that's my group, and I live in almost in an echo chamber within that group. So my position has always been, if you want to know something from somebody, ask. When I was doing the Black Women Startup Report, it was a qualitative research where I just went and organized these focus groups of Black women to just ask them. Like, because I didn't know, there was nothing in the research. There was a huge research deficit. So I'm like, let me just sit down and ask what your motivations are, what are your challenges are, things like that. And from that, I gained significant insight into the experiences of Black women, which made me more sensitive to any program that I would design for them because it was informed by them, right? Simple thing that, look at me, I'm bald, right? The thing I never considered as being a huge consideration for me is the fact that Black women are concerned, a lot of Black women express concern about the role that their natural hair played in the workplace. Now, me, it was never a problem because I'm from a Black community, so I would see dreads or natural hair. And it was just, I'm like, okay, I like that or I don't. I mean, you look good in it or you don't. It wasn't like, oh, this is some kind of professional experience or professional problem. But a lot of Black women were saying, hey, I have to constantly think about how people perceive my hair. So that's something that is I would not have known, if I had not sat down and asked, because in my experience, I'm like, I'm bald. I'm more worried about people thinking me not having any hair versus what my hairstyle is. So it's those little things like that. And I just use that as an example of a wide variety of other things where the simple process of sitting down with people and asking what their experiences is versus assuming what their experiences are goes a long way, because it does a few things. So and this is a lesson for every inclusive ecosystem builder, is take the time to go out and have coffee or calls with individuals, maybe do focus groups with the groups that you don't feel are currently participating within your ecosystem programs and platforms. And ask the question, say, hey, we do this, is there any reason why, you would not participate, whether they're an entrepreneur currently or not? I mean, let them tell you, and start crafting your strategy and your interactions based upon that, because it solves a multitude of things, right? First of all, by me sitting down with Black women the way that I did, and now talking to over 500 or more of them over the past years at the outreach events, it gave me a much more richer appreciation for their experiences. Even me as a Black man, coming from a Black community, it extraordinarily increased my understanding and appreciation for them as individuals, as entrepreneurs, as anchors in the community, right? So that's one. Two, the other side of the equation is it allowed them to start forming relationships of trust with me, because they recognize that my consistency over time and my support of them as a group of individuals was important to them, because nobody else was ever doing it. Nobody else was doing it. So it allowed them to feel like I was really somebody that could be trustworthy, which is an anchor point of relationships. Like a lot of diverse communities, women, minorities, whatever, have been told and sold so many fake promises over such a long period of time that you're not just going to walk up in there and be like, hey, I got this this great thing that I'm going to give you that's going to change your world. Because we've been told that so many times. Like, we can go back to whether it's the presidents, whether it's the grants, whether it's the opportunity zone type policies that were all nominally set to kind of address some of our major conditions. And none of them happened. None of them worked, or a lot of them were exploited, or a lot of them did the reverse. A lot of grant people come into communities and have these national grants, and then, you know, when the grant runs out, they leave because there's no commitment outside of the funding that they receive, and these things matter. So sitting down with them begins to create an anchor of trust, an anchor of empathy, an anchor of understanding of that experience, and it also begins to give you ideas on how to inform, you know, your programs and activities to be able to support that particular group. I've been drawing a lot from tech over the last couple years in this regard, and so I'm super high on the concept of design thinking. For those of you familiar with that, the concept of empathy mapping as a way to understand the potential user of your product or service, user experience, UX models, designing with gathering understanding of designing programs and activities with how the user would most likely intend to use it. All of those different things, you know, these qualitative, you know, methodologies where, you know, you're doing focus groups, interviews, resources, formal and informal, things of that nature, to really get to know it. That's your intentionality. You start with intentionality, then you deal with your empathy and seeking to understand through relationship formation what the groups that traditionally you think should be involved and are not involved, and gather that level of understanding. And I almost think after that point, if you have a group that's truly committed to the process, that alone is going to push you in a pathway where now you can look at based upon all your skill set. Okay, based upon my skill set and what I understand about it and what I understand about them, these are some ways that I could design. Then, of course, once you design and you launch, and you also go back and say, is this really working the way we thought? So we thought we did a great job of being informed by these various diverse individuals to craft this. Is it really working the way we want? That requires another round of leveraging your relationships that you should have now, in terms of going back and asking, well, wow, you know, we designed this with hopefully with you in mind and you informing us, you know, whether it's at the leadership level, policy making level, or just as an external advisor, but we're not seeing the results that we had hoped. Is there a reason why? Gives you another opportunity. So those, I would say, like my friend again at Kauffman, Andy Stoll, says, he said, like a couple years ago at a conference, 80% of ecosystem building is the same. It's the 20% that makes all the difference. And that 20% is the things like culture, engagement, relationships, trust, all of these other things that happen. So those are kind of the ways that I would organize it. Like, I don't think at this point we need to be too prescriptive. Like, there's obviously stuff that's out there that talks about how do you do focus groups, how do you do empathy mapping, how do you do asset mapping. All of those are out there. But the fundamental principle for you all is the framework of, I'm going to ask and attempt to understand and empathize. And then I'm going to design or build or recruit or do whatever else I do.
Yeah, that's great, Dell. Thank you so much. I think And we always, this is what we talk to entrepreneurs about, right? Understanding your customer, understanding how they feel when they're related to your product. And it's something I think we all as ecosystem builders can strive to do better at, to really understand how we can best serve our communities. So I think we're going to switch over to some audience questions. Heather, would you like to ask your question first?
Hey, Dell. It's so fun to see you virtually coming to Tucson. My question is that in our community and lots of communities, there's like an economic development club, and it's mostly white folks. And they're the heads of banks, and they're the successful entrepreneurs that have exited. They're the heads of the chambers of commerce, accelerators and incubators. And then they create the policies, programs, and they do that work for the community. How do we break that apart?
Yeah.
Like that echo chamber is just bigger and bigger.
So we have a few things going on now. So the dissertation that I'm near done writing is really trying to ground ecosystem building. Even though it's focused on relationship formation, what it does is it tries to ground ecosystem building in the field of economic development. Because for so long, really that hasn't been the case. Like ecosystem building has been seen as this thing over here and it's cool and it can produce some of these shiny objects, meaning these growth companies and blah, blah, blah. But like your traditional economic development field really paid a very, very little attention, right? I'm a certified economic developer through IADC. I did that just so I could go through all the classes and have relationships and understand what that orientation is. So that's a problem that we have to figure out how to bridge. So that problem is actually unique to the inclusivity problem in ecosystems, because that's a field problem, right? Where you have this field that's been so dominant for so long and so many structures have been in place to reinforce it, like the whole incentive, policy packages that our states are putting to recruit firms, is an extension of that model of development. So that's a hard nut to crack. I think what we have to do as a field and as ecosystem builders, and this gets into your program models, is we really have to be strong with trying to identify metrics of success and figuring out ways to attach them back to local economic growth or some form of other social and economic benefit. And to me, in that regard, that's where inclusivity becomes even more important, because if I can show through ecosystem building that I was able to really produce economic growth in these communities that historically by the dominant group have been seen as a drag on the economy or a challenge to the economy, then that makes a compelling argument going forward as to why some of those big economic development dollars that are going through states for incentives and recruitment and retention should be steered our way. Because I see somebody asked Brian, he pointed out something about the funding side of ecosystem building. Well, I would argue that it's if you look at the traditional economic development organizations, ecosystem builders aren't funded the same way. Like your traditional chamber or your traditional municipal economic development organization is funded through some form of state appropriation, or they're funded through corporate membership and other fundings to support the work of economic development. But how many of us ecosystem builders can say we're funded that same way? So a lot of us are sometimes we get a government contract or two, sometimes we get some grants, sometimes we have revenue-driven models, but none of us are really anchored into the usual economic development funding process and mechanisms that states use to do economic development. So by demonstrating proof of concept, by consistently communicating the value of what you do through policy advocacy and interaction, hopefully we can start shaking some of that up. Now, the rest of it is on people like myself, the Kauffman Foundation, and those that are working to build the field at a national level to continue to say, look, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So look at your economic development policy and look at what's happening and say, is this the way you want to be the next 20 years? So the 99.9% of everything that I write at the Fed is to put the Fed logo on something to support you all, right? So I write something for Black women to put a Fed logo on it so that we can support Black women better in the nation. I write stuff for ecosystem builders to put the Fed logo on it so I can support ecosystem builders across the nation, because I know that coming from the policy, the largest policy, monetary policy institute in the world, and the historical credibility of that institution, that logo amplifies the voices that I know you all have that you would not otherwise have if I did not put that logo on it. So what you do locally is those things that I suggested, and then hopefully you can support the work we do nationally, where you can plug in while recognizing that oftentimes your time and funding are limited to be able to do so.
Great, thanks, Dell. I think we'll switch to Stephanie's question. Stephanie, do you want to ask it?
I don't. I've given a shot at the bridge work and developing a community specifically for Latinos. Some of the things you were saying, I felt like you were talking directly to me. Thanks for that, by the way. But my question is really around, like, when it comes to doing that bridge work, how do we share responsibility? How do we have those hard conversations that need to be had to really create structural change and not just play diversity? And it's a hard conversation, right? No, diversity it's the diversity issue. If we could choose one, any examples around navigating around that?
When you say, can you define bridge work for me?
Yeah. So there has presently, or the prominent startup community, as it's known, is not necessarily reflective of the individuals that I serve. So the bridge work that I am doing is in doing mobility, right, and offering entrepreneurial services and education for the people at the barrio level, right, at the neighborhood level. But then my work, my success in my work will be when I can create a bridge in that community and educating that community and allowing us to successfully mutually gain responsibility in community and kind of bringing those things together, right? So I feel like if I'm the only one hitting, or it's got to kind of come together. And I'm just curious, like, how do we make that happen, knowing that this conversation stems up a lot of like sensitivities, and like nobody wants to create an issue. We want to do it like the right way. And I'm just curious about examples of like that you've seen where that has been done successfully, where you can manage that in the right way. I'm really thirsty for seeing something like that, and I'm just curious if you know of anything.
This is the challenge. Is people ask me all the time, well, who can you point to that's doing this well? And I say nobody, ever, unless you go back in history. And then you go back in history, and it was done under, like, so when we say Black Wall Street was achieved under Jim Crow, and Jim Crow segregation was what kind of allowed certain features of that to happen. But I asked a question on Startup Spaces podcast the other day. I said, why are we not looking towards little China's as an example of ecosystem building? We have little Italies. Like, you can go to San Francisco. Where was I at? San Francisco, Boston. I was in Boston, and I went to their little China, like little China's, where it's kind of predominantly businesses and owned by Chinese, and you have people from all over that city that comes to Little China to patronize the businesses of the Chinese. It's very culturally unique, idiosyncratic within a community. And I'm like, why do we never look at them, like communities like that, these enclaves, as examples of ecosystem building in communities of color? Because clearly they managed to do the things that we think an ecosystem should do, while retaining a sense of cultural identity, while in turn empowering the local economy of the entire city based upon what they do with that. So what we're doing, and this is, if anything, my research on ecosystem building has shown that there's no one right way to do it. There's only frameworks of doing it. So what you're trying to do, you have to make a lot of decisions as to where do you start with it. Do you start with trying to build the bridges, or do you start with trying to build the capacity of the group that you're currently working on by informing them about opportunities, about trying to help re-socialize them to different types of entrepreneurship, exposing them to ways things can be done, building up that level of local energy, and then bridging? Like, I cannot answer that questions for you, because your community is going to be unique to you and what you see. So, but you have to know that you have to ask and answer those questions, because we have to think about this. Like, in every scenario, there's an actor and there's a context. Sometimes you're going to have to try to influence the context, which is the place we operate in and live in and interact in. Some places you're going to have to transform the actor. Sometimes you're going to do both at the same time. That's ecosystem building. So if it was me, I can only speak for me, and some of the things that after I finish the dissertation, I'm going to start trying to stand up in Omaha, and I see trying to be stood up in other areas, is I'm going to start with my community, and I'm going to start with organizing them, getting them to interact, helping them build a network amongst each other with specific groups. We're going to stand up something. I started working with a young lady. We're going to stand up a entity called Black Founders of Nebraska, which is going to focus on Black tech founders, and I very narrowed it, Black tech founders, in Nebraska, predominantly identified in Omaha and Lincoln, to try to build a network amongst them first, then connect them to the other elements outside of that particular community of action. In Kansas City's probably having one of the most rapid momentums that I could see in terms of developing kind of this inclusive higher growth entrepreneurship ecosystem building. Over the last 3 to 4 years, they've stood up 4 minority specific ecosystem building, programs at scale, like Rodney Sampson's OHUB model, which focuses on high tech and growth, the Enterprise model under AltCap, that's probably the biggest national organization for supporting growth oriented minority firms. They brought their program there. The city stood up a program under KC BizCare, which focuses on minority entrepreneurs and firms. And then you have a wide variety of other, smaller activities that are taking place in that area, all that emerged within 3 to 4 years because the energy was there. But then you had a set of actors that said, we want to capture this energy and put some program T to it. So I would say, really, you have to look at what you're seeing in the environment. I would bring other people around you that support your vision and what you're trying to achieve. Start with your collaboration hyper-local. Identify what needs to happen hyper-locally. Look at the ways your people, in your neighborhood are interacting or what their aspirations are. Organize them and then start connecting them and pushing them into the broader ecosystem network, because then bare minimum, if they experience certain forms of racism and discrimination, when you start putting them out into these broader ecosystem programs, that they know they can come home to you. Like they're not just there and left out on an island. And then it also gives you an opportunity to take your group and give that ecosystem program that may be exclusionary, feedback in a constructive way. Right now, we don't have these kind of feedback loop mechanisms, accountability mechanisms in our neighborhoods to be able to do so. So that's kind of how I would process it.
Great, thanks so much, Dell. I think we got to most people's questions kind of interweaved in what you were talking about, and we're almost out of time. So I do want to ask you our kind of final question that we ask all our guests. And this one, I'm hoping you'll maybe answer a little more with working with direct entrepreneurs, but it's kind of up to you. If you have a particular story, like about a ecosystem builder or something, that's fine too. So what's your favorite story of entrepreneurial success, and what do you attribute that success to?
So I was a business banker, right? And all my business banking was in the hood. Like I started for like 4 months in our Latino sport, maybe 6 months. I was an in-store banker, which is the worst form of banker you can possibly be in a grocery store. So you stand up all day, you're a teller, so you're cashing people's checks and you're trying to sell open accounts and loans. It's terrible. But I started in our Hispanic community here in Omaha, and all they did was teach me the dirty words. So that's the only thing I can speak in Spanish is the dirty words. So that there was there. And then the rest of my banking experience was in our Black community in Omaha. So I've from in-store banker, personal banker, business banker, small business banker, boom, 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 boom. So as weird as this seems, the thing that sticks out the most to me is there was this guy who would come in all the time in kind of like one of those jumpsuit outfits like trash men wear. And this was still past the Jerry Curl days. Like my Black audience will know what I'm talking about probably more than anybody else. But the Jerry curl days were still long gone, because this is in the 2000s, and Jerry curls pretty much went out, with some rare exceptions of some weird people who just want to hold on to it after that. So this guy would come in with the Jerry curl bag, right? So the Jerry curl bag is this clear bag that you put over your Jerry curl to keep the juices fresh, to keep your curls in place and from dripping everywhere. And this guy would come into the bank, all the time, and I'm not thinking anything of it. And this guy was making well over 6 figures a year just hauling people's stuff, right? Like, and you would never have known it if I wasn't a business banker, because you would look at him and say, man, who's this guy in this ratty jumpsuit and this Jerry curl juice bag? But he was generating a lot of revenue for an individual just by doing something that was a critical need in the community. There was this young African-American lady. At the time, she probably couldn't have been over 30, right? And I'm not thinking anything of her. I see her, and I see Black women all the time in my job, because they come in and out of the bank, and I'm in my neighborhood. And so she's nothing special, probably even dressed a little worse than the average, Black women in my community. Man, this young lady owned like 30 properties, maybe more. These are the things that, always stand out to me, is that we have entrepreneurs. So the question isn't entrepreneurs in the Latino community, the Native community. It's not a question of women having entrepreneurial talent, Black people. The question often is, we have not given them the ability to express that entrepreneurial, capacity the same way we've given other groups. And I'll be honest, we have not given that to white males either. Like, the American society has spent decades trying to weed out great entrepreneurs, because they're trying to put them all into corporations, right? So our greatest gift to the United States, and I would almost say the world, not to try to be too melodramatic about it, is by freeing up the entrepreneurial ability of the people of America, regardless of race, ethnicity, and gender, by doing effective entrepreneurship ecosystem building, so that they can save us. Because we are on, my opinion only, the way our economy is structured now, with this hyper corporate orientation, is not sustainable. The wealth gap is only going to get bigger. The social unrest is only going to get greater, in large part because of the issues around economics. And our future generation, last point, because I know we're at time. So I used to say this a lot, and the first time I said it was at the National Economic Gardening Conference. I said, I want you just to conceive of this and the impact that it have on the economy. Our Hispanic population is going like this. Our white population is going like this. We'll be a majority minority country by the year 2050, if not sooner. But yet our average Hispanic business is 3 times smaller than the average white business and hires 3 times less employees. So what happens when that $450,000 white business is replaced by a $150,000 Hispanic business who hires only one out of the same 3 people that white business would hire? One population is going up, the one with smaller businesses. One population is going down, the one with bigger businesses. Just think about it rationally, what that does to the United States economy. And if that's not an argument for better inclusive entrepreneurship and the better support of Hispanic entrepreneurs in the United States from an economic perspective, I honestly don't know what is.
I wish we had given you a mic so that you could just drop it right now. That was incredible. I know our team is definitely feeling reinvigorated about our mission and our focus and how to better engage different communities. I hope that all of our guests that took the time to join us today are as well. And I hope that if you know someone in our community, to Stephanie and Heather's points, that would benefit from what Dell talked to us about today, that once this link is live and the video is ready, that you will share that with them. We can't do this alone. We all need to do this together, and we all need to be thinking about it and talking about it a lot more. So thank you so much, Dell. I do want to say our next speaker in innovation economics is September 17th. It's Sue Key. She's the director of the Motown Music Accelerator in Detroit, Michigan. Dell, do you know her?
I don't.
No? So we're super excited to have her. Yeah, you can come back and join us. So the Motown Music Accelerator is a 12-week business program for musicians or bands. It was recently named one of the world's most innovative companies in Fast Company 2020. In partnership with TechTown Detroit and Generator, the program demonstrated the power of creative entrepreneurship for economic development and cultural capital. And she is both a musician herself and also the director of this groundbreaking program. So we are very excited to have her join us next month to kind of talk about creative entrepreneurship, different types of programs to support different industries, and what we can do in Tucson to kind of support our creative and music community. Thank you again, Dell, for spending this time with us, and thank you all for being here. We will see you soon.